Want to add flash to your outdoor photography? It's not quite as tricky as you think. I'm going to tell you how to do it on today's episode of
Ask David Bergman.
Hey there everyone, welcome back. Here I am, as always, answering your photography questions. Don't forget to go to AskDavidBergman.com. Ask your own photo questions right there on the site. I just might pick it to answer here on a future show. Also, I hope you're already a subscriber to the Adorama YouTube channel. If not, go ahead and click that button down below. Use the little bell icon so you get notifications. You'll be the first to know as soon as new shows come out all week long from myself and the other photo hosts right here on Adorama TV. Today's question was sent in by Paul D, and he wants to know, can you explain how you balance flash and ambient light outdoors during the day? Okay, so of course, when we're referring to ambient light, we're just talking about the existing light that's in the environment, whatever that is. If it's at night, it might be light coming off the buildings. It could be moonlight, but then during the day, usually, of course, it's going to be sunlight, whether it's diffused light or direct light. That's all the ambient light that's going to exist in the environment, and that's going to affect our photographs. Now, why would you use flash outdoors during the day when, of course, there's usually plenty of light there? Well, there are really two reasons to do it. The first one is quality. We talk a lot about light modifiers when we're working here in the studio, where we can control every piece of light that's hitting our subject. That's going to give you control over things like the light direction, the color, soft light or hard light. But the thing is, if you move outdoors, you're kind of stuck with what's there. Of course, if you're only shooting with the ambient light outdoors, you can make a few decisions to affect your image. You can choose the time of day you're going to shoot and really where you place your subject and what angle the light is hitting them. But you're still kind of limited by what's there. By adding flash outdoors, it's going to give you all the benefits of high quality studio lighting while still having an outdoor environment as your backdrop. Now, exactly which modifiers you want to use to get the quality you want, of course, that's a personal preference. I've done videos about that. There are lots of videos out there about different modifiers, and I'm sure that's a never-ending topic that we'll keep discussing over and over. But that's a personal preference depending on the look you want. But really, the other reason to add flash to an outdoor shoot is not only change the quality, but also the quantity of light. The technical part of this trips up some photographers, so that's really what I'm going to focus on here today. Now, you can actually use flash to change not only the light that's hitting your subject, but also the brightness of the background. Understanding how to tweak that ratio of foreground light to background light can significantly change the look of your images. Now, here's the thought process of making that work. In most cases, you can't change, obviously, the lights in your background, right? Of course, if it's something like a city skyline, you wouldn't be able to put strobes all throughout the city. Of course, that would be really cool if you could, but realistically, that's not going to happen. But you can change how bright or how dark your entire image is by changing your camera exposure settings, right? So once you have that locked in, then you simply add in the flash to get the foreground looking how you want. It's really kind of simple once you wrap your head around it. So I'm going to go through it step by step. I brought my mannequin back out into the backyard of my office complex here. I wanted to keep it simple and consistent. It's a bit of an overcast day, unfortunately, but you still should be able to understand how this works. Now, I've always said that setting both your camera and flash on manual, 100% manual, is going to give you the most control over the look of your images. And this is absolutely no exception. Using an auto mode on your flash like TTL might give me inconsistent results, and shooting manual is also going to help us to understand exactly what's happening. So I'm going to start with an image using only ambient light. Now, like I said, I can choose how bright or how dark my ambient exposure is by changing my camera's exposure settings. It's an overcast day, like I said, so I've got my ISO locked at 1250, and I'm not going to change it. Eliminating that variable is going to make this much easier to understand. So forget about ISO, that's just locked in place. Now, this image looks fine at f8 at a 60th of a second, but if I want to make the entire image, let's say 2 stops darker, I can change either one of those settings, aperture or shutter speed, right? So I'm going to choose to speed up my shutter speed to 2/50th of a second. I don't want to change the aperture, and I'm going to get into why I don't want to do that in a few minutes. But if I speed up that shutter speed 2 stops, now I was at 60th, I'm going to go to 2/50th of a second, then everything, including my background, is going to be 2 stops darker, right? So now I want to add in the flash. I'm using a Canon Speedlite in the 60-inch Photek SoftLighter umbrella without the diffusion. And since my flash power is on manual, I can actually change the amount of light that's coming out of that flash by changing its power setting. I think 1/4 power is a bit too bright in this case. So by changing it down to 16th power, I think it's just right. Notice that changing the flash power from quarter power to 16th power doesn't change the background at all because that light isn't traveling far enough to hit the background and is only hitting my subject. So it's only going to affect the way my subject looks. Now, since that's the case, I can control the foreground and background independently of each other because I can change that ratio. The background exposure is controlled by both my shutter speed and my aperture and ISO. I know that, but we're leaving that alone for this demo. But that's how I change the background, shutter speed and aperture. But to change the flash on my subject in the foreground, there are only two things that are going to affect that exposure. The first we just talked about, that's the flash power setting. So what if I want to make the subject brighter and I'm already at full power on my flash? Or maybe I'm at a lower power setting, but I might prefer to shoot that way because I'm going to get faster recycle time and it's going to make my batteries last longer. So what can I do in that case? Well, the other way to control how much flash shows in your image is by changing your aperture. Closing down the width of your lens restricts the amount of light that can come through there, right? So that makes perfect sense. As you close it down, less light's going to come through. So the flash is still putting out the same amount of light on the subject, but less of it is going to get through the sensor, through that lens, because I'm closing down the aperture. So it's going to make my image darker. However, the trick here is when I close down my aperture 2 stops, let's say from f8 to f16, I'm going to darken both my flash and my ambient background. Remember, the ambient is also controlled by shutter speed and aperture. So to get my background back up to where it was before I close down my aperture, I have to slow down my shutter speed the same amount, 2 stops, from, in this case, 2/50th of a second to 60th of a second. So as you can see, shutter speed will affect the ambient light, but actually has no effect on the flash because the flash is on for such a short period of time, really shorter than the camera's maximum sync speed. Think of sync speed this way. When you take a picture, the shutter opens, right, and exposes your sensor. While it's open, the flash turns on, and then the flash turns off, and then the shutter closes up again, covering up that sensor. So speeding up or slowing down your shutter doesn't actually change the amount of time that the flash is on and hitting your sensor. So shutter speed has no effect. Only aperture will affect the amount of light from your flash. And by the way, for this video, I'm taking advanced functions like high-speed sync off the table. I don't want to go there. That's going to get needlessly complicated and probably a subject for another video. So understanding all of that, I know it sounds a bit complicated. Play it again if you have to, slow it down, which you can do on YouTube. But understanding all of that allows you to independently control your foreground and your background, and you can get the exact amount of light that you want on either one. There's one other scenario I just want to mention before we go, and this is all pretty straightforward if you want your background to be darker than your subject, because the flash simply adds light where you want it. To where it's dark, you can add flash, right? You can add light. But what if you're trying to make a high key portrait where the background is actually brighter than the subject or as bright as the subject? If I go back to shooting without the flash with my mannequin here, and I set my ambient exposure to a 60th of a second at f4, the background looks how I want it in this case, nice and bright, right? But there's already a lot of light on my subject. So adding light from a flash isn't going to have much of an effect. It's only really going to, you're only going to see a change in the areas of my subject that are darker than the light being put out by the flash. So at a 30-second power, the flash is only going to lighten up the shadow areas just a little bit and not give me that pretty studio light, that dramatic look that I'm trying to create. If I turn the flash power way up to 1/8 power, let's say, it's just going to be a bright, washed out mess. This is especially true if it was the middle of a day and it was really bright out and that unflattering sunlight was hitting my subject's face. It's going to be really hard to flatten that out while still having enough light to make that high key background. The only way to make this work is you have to make the ambient light on your subject darker before adding the flash. So a few ways to do that. You can either find a way to put them in the shade, for example, while you can still see the background that you want. Maybe you could turn them around to face away from the sun, or use something like a scrim or a reflector to actually block some of the ambient light from hitting them. Then you simply add in the flash to get the look you want. I did a shoot a couple years ago with Marisa for a 2-minute tip video where I used a reflector to block out the sun. I'm going to put a link below if you want to watch that whole thing. But really, that's how you balance ambient light and flash outdoors during the day. I hope that helped you, Paul, and everyone else who might have wondered the same thing. Keep those photo questions coming. I sincerely appreciate it. Remember, you go to AskDavidBergman.com, fill out the form there. If you like this video, go ahead and click the like button below, please, the thumbs up. You can comment. Don't forget to subscribe. check out my workshops. I do hopefully eventually live workshops again. In the meantime, I'm doing online workshops. You go to shootfromthepit.com to get information about that. And then, of course, join me back here every Monday, 10 a.m. Eastern on Adorama TV. I'll be back next week with a new episode right here. Come back for Ask David Bergman.